Welcome to Theme Park Academy, brought to you in partnership with blooloop. Dive into the world of themed attractions with us as we give the inside scoop directly from the people who make the news and decisions. Whether we're tackling the big issues, examining how decisions affect the bottom line, or guiding those new to the industry, this podcast is your gateway understanding and mastering the art of theme park entertainment. Thanks for joining us this week. Hey, Mark, how's it going?
Oh, good, thank you. How are you?
Oh, pretty good, pretty good. You have a good break?
Yeah, it was really nice. I didn't do much over the Christmas and New Year period, which was much needed. I didn't
Uh-huh.
realize how much of a rest I needed over that time until I started work again. But yeah, no, it was great. Thank you. How was yours?
It was nice. It was nice. You know, the usual kind of relax some, hang out with the family, all those good things.
All the best things.
So we are in a new year, and instead of just doing the news over the holidays, it's kind of a slow time for our industry. We thought we'd say what is going to happen in 2025. So join us with some predictions, and we can review these at the end of the year to see if one or both of us were right. So, Mark, you want to start it off?
Yeah, one of my predictions is I think intellectual property is going to be really big at the end of this year. Now, we know that IP features in a lot of theme parks, it's growing year on year. I think this year is going to be a really big boom year for it. Now, speaking to a couple of IPs, there's quite a lot at the moment that are wanting to get into this industry more. So as opposed to what it used to be, where parks said, we really like your license, we want your brand, we want your name, these brands are actively going out trying to get into this market now and contacting theme parks and contacting experiences to put their brand into their experience. And I think this year is going to be a really big growth year for it. I've heard a couple of rumblings of big things that are happening. So I'm really excited to see it. I think it's going to be a great year for IP.
That's a really good observation. I think one change that I saw was in the past, the parks were using IP to draw people in. You know, they said, we'll spend the money on the IP and bring the guests in. And that sort of flipped now because IPs are saying, well, that's where people are. So many people are in digital spaces online, but physical spaces, whether you're in Asia, the US, or Europe, those physical spaces, a commonality is theme parks. And I think brands are really seeing that people are spending time and money in these spaces and they need to spend money to get into the park. So that dynamic has really shifted.
Yeah, and I think from that standpoint as well, being in a real physical world environment like a theme park, I think it's a really good platform for brands to have that connectivity with audiences as well. Now, it's great on digital. Yes, you might see advertisements or pop-ups or whatever that may be, or interactive gaming for brands. But to be in a real world environment where people are having these great experiences together that bond them and connect them together, I think it's just a really good placement for brands to be in, and it's a really great way to connect with audiences out of home. So yeah, and I'm super excited for this year. I think IP is going to be a strong one.
And my prediction isn't as rosy, I guess, but one thing I'm seeing, and to me, it's a bit of a concern, is just that sort of the splitting by whether you want to call it class or income of the guest experiences. You know, historically, I'd say at least in the post-war for the U.S. market, you know, amusement parks are very much a democratic small D institution in a way. It was very much someplace that no matter how much money you made, you were able to get into it and enjoy the whole day there. And we're really seeing that premium experiences have been really good for parks. But I think one flip side is that if you just want to go to a park now, it's a lot harder to just enjoy everything in it. And I do think we're going to see that continue. But I do hope that a lot of these parks understand that there are people who just want to come enjoy it and that they can't pay for every premium experience, but that base cost still gets them access to a good day with their family or friends.
Absolutely, it is. Everybody's purses or wallets are getting a bit tighter, aren't they? It's getting harder and harder. And I think you're absolutely right that there's a lot of experiences out there that are multi-day visits as well. So I think there's going to be quite a big impact on that where it's not achievable to take your whole family to be there for one day. And I don't know how that'll fit with multi-day visits. I think I'm kind of on the back of that as well. And this isn't a lovely thing, but I do think some parks might have to react in terms of looking at their operations and potentially cutting costs to some extent from an operational perspective, because operational budgets are so expensive for parks, and it'll be really interesting to see how what you're talking about, Adam, what the reaction is to that from a park perspective. It'll be really interesting to see at the end of this year if that does start to affect the parks or not.
And one anecdote to that I've actually seen, and I do hope it happens, is I've heard some parks are talking about taking on more full-time employees because at least in the US market where you're seeing Halloween, really grew the season and now you have Christmas, we are seeing a lot of parks here is saying, well, instead of trying to find seasonal after seasonal after seasonal, why don't we have more full-time employees? It actually lowers the cost to bring them in full time instead of having to have all these hourly workers, and then they also get a better understanding of the business too. So I do think that is one kind of great addition to that whole growing the season, is really just finding people who could hire full time. If operators can bring their costs down by bringing them in and they get employees that understand the business better, I see that really as a win-win for both employees and parks.
Absolutely. I'm probably guest experience as well, because if you've got people who specialize and they know that brand inside out, they're going to be really good brand ambassadors as well. So that'll
Hmm.
be a really kind
Hmm.
of, that'll be the silver lining to the horrible dark cloud that is the economy around the world at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's kind of a nice segue into our guest today. So, Mark, do you want to introduce Daniel, who specializes in actually growing your business throughout the winter year?
Absolutely. So today we've got an amazing guest, who is Daniel Noake, and he is a seasoned professional in creating seasonal experiences and events around the world. So he's worked with IMG, he's worked with Live Nation, and he's now with a company called Hammerton Barca, and he's a managing partner and executive producer. We're going to be talking about how he brings real ice to the Middle East, which is a really interesting conversation to have. So I'm so excited to have him on the show.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to it. So, yeah, let's go talk to Daniel.
So, Daniel, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. Do you want to just give our listeners a little bit of a background of you and the type of work that you do?
Yeah, I'm an event producer. I live and work in Africa, in Rwanda. I've spent the last 6 years or so living in the East African region. I'm originally British, as you can tell from the accent, but I've also spent a fair amount of time in the US. Spent 3, 4 years in the US working on events and activations, all sorts of different things there. But largely an event producer by trade, working in the entertainment and sometimes the sports industry.
Amazing. And I believe some of the events that you've been involved with are quite a lot of specialized around winter or winterization and ice events and things. Do you want to tell us a little bit about those and why you think they've got such like a universal appeal?
Yeah, I mean, when I left university, I was almost by chance went to work on an outdoor ice rink, which was in York, in North Yorkshire, in the UK, as an event manager, and then went to London, started working in television for a bit, and then saw a job come up at a company called IMG, a big event producer, US company, but with a very large presence in the UK. Looking for somebody to take on the running of the Natural History Museum ice rink, which is sadly no more. But I think I was probably the only person that they could find that had ever seen an outdoor ice rink event in the past. So I'd like to say I got it on merit, but I think I was basically the only option, and ended up working at IMG for almost 10 years. All of that time working on multiple events, but consistently the Natural History Museum ice rink uh, uh, and that event throughout my time. Started as an event coordinator and left as event director of that event and some others. Had a wonderful time, but the specialism sort of caught me by surprise. And winterized events now is a huge industry. And actually, at the time I was at IMG, it became a much bigger industry, and that growth, I think, continues. And you start to see events popping up, as we're going to talk about, in the Middle East. Lots of parts of Asia now, particularly in Singapore and Hong Kong, have winter wonderland style temporary events and temporary theme parks, effectively. So it's a specialization that caught me by surprise, but it's turned into quite a big industry, and obviously that specialization has proved to be an advantage in some circumstances.
That's brilliant. And in terms of, you just mentioned obviously Singapore, you've mentioned the Middle East as well. What do you think the appeal is for people in those regions to want these type of winterized events?
I think it depends who you talk to. I mean, I think for the Middle East, obviously, is very top down in terms of event hosting strategy. So I think the government sees tourism and growth in tourism. And certainly you see a lot of Middle Eastern strategy particularly in Saudi Arabia now, of course, geared towards driving growth in tourism. I'm actually about to start work on a project in Jordan, which will be with the USAID, and that's about developing tourism strategy through entertainment events and festivals, music concerts, etc. So it's very tourism driven. I think in Asia there is a nostalgia, genuine nostalgia for Christmas, and in places like Singapore, Christmas is celebrated. But I mean, I think we're everybody always says this. We're in an age of increased globalization where cultures mix. And it's very much a visually driven culture as well through social media platforms like Instagram and TikTok. So getting the right shot, getting the right post is really important. I think the winter wonderland, if you like, aesthetic is very good from a social media. It always plays well on social media. But I think if you're talking to consumers and people that attend the events, I think where winterized events are most successful is where you've got a market where you've got an older audience that is buying into a nostalgia of what Christmas used to be like when they were a kid. And I've got young children myself, and so Christmas has a completely different meaning for me now, as opposed to when it was just me and my wife sat around, getting bored with the family. So that nostalgia piece, I think, is very powerful in terms of events, but particularly winterized events.
That's amazing. And what I'm kind of really keen to hear and probe on a little bit is, especially the Middle East, you just mentioned Jordan. What are some of the difficulties in bringing winterized events, which we all obviously associate with cold weather, which is just not the case a lot of the time? So what are some of the difficulties that you face bringing these events to life?
Well, you've nailed it, Mark. I mean, it's the climate. I mean, I was in Doha a few years ago now, building a temporary outdoor ice rink, and it was the first time an outdoor ice rink had ever been attempted in that part of the world. And the climate makes it incredibly difficult. It's not necessarily the heat, as some people would obviously guess, but also wind. The acidity of the air, the climate in general can have a massive effect on how feasible it is just to get water frozen and stay frozen across 1,000 square meters effectively. So definitely the climate and the weather is a major challenge. I think in terms of the running of the event and the visitor experience, obviously there are cultural aspects to that, and certainly you have to be mindful of cultural differences. So in the Middle East, obviously, Christmas is not traditionally celebrated. Obviously, in the globalized world that we live in, there's a lot of exposure to Christmas as a secular celebration, as a secular holiday. So I think there's a level at which you do it, which is obviously very different to how you would do it in Germany or the UK, for instance.
And that perfectly kind of brings me on to my next question that I've got for you as well, which is, what adaptations do you need to kind of create, or how do you think about the event in a different way rather than a Christmas event being just a winterized event in these different places?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, winterized events in general tend to be based around kind of snow-based attractions. So you've got indoor ski slopes, for instance. There's a lot of that in the Middle East, for instance, and in Asia now. Certainly ice-based attractions in permanent facilities like indoor ice rinks. I think the kind of challenges are kind of cultural in a sporting sense around some of that, where you've got people that are used to going skiing or used to going ice skating in Europe, particularly, certainly in mainland Europe. I mean, there's almost a received wisdom about how to take part in snow sports, in ice-based sports. Lots of people's parents, own a pair of ice skates, particularly in mainland European countries, for instance, and lots of parts of Scandinavia where it is kind of part of the culture. So I think there's that kind of, in Europe, Scandinavia, certainly we're dealing with people that really understand what this is about and know how to take part. I think in other parts of the world, there is that kind of educational piece of learning how to take part where it's not necessarily engendered in the culture.
Makes sense. And I guess when you guys are building all of these unique attractions and concepts, obviously sustainability is a big thing that people talk about now. How do you ensure that or work toward having sustainable aspects of these projects?
Yeah, it's really important. And obviously the first, when I talk to people about building 1,000 square meter ice rink in the middle of the desert in Qatar, the first thing that comes across people's minds is how green is that and how
Yeah.
environmentally friendly is that? And it's a very valid concern. There are lots of ways now to make productions like that much more sustainable. Obviously, in terms of the format, there is a limit to how sustainable you can make it.
Sure.
We are still freezing an enormous amount of water. I will say that the investment in power, if you like, and it is an enormous amount of power and chilling capacity to do an event like that, it's all up front. So once you actually get the ice frozen, the requirement to keep it ticking over just to keep it frozen isn't as high. And actually can be quite efficient. For instance, in Doha, when we built the ice rink, we only operated at night when the temperature was much lower. And actually, if your temperature is stable, then the investment in power is much lower. Obviously, you can run things off of ground power instead of generators. And I'm not saying that obviously ground power is carbon neutral by any stretch, but it is certainly much more environmentally friendly when you're tapping into a nation's power mix, which is obviously a mix of various different generation sources, instead of just burning diesel. If you do have to burn diesel, obviously you can use synthetic diesel now. It's incredibly expensive, but obviously where we're working in places like the Middle East and budgets tend to be a little bit higher, there is more consideration paid to the green aspects of that over finite costs of financing. So it does become possible to use things like synthetic diesel and synthetic fuels, which obviously have a lower impact on the environment. So we tend to look at things like that. I would say that some of the most effective things are just the efficiency measures that we will put in place. If you're talking about ski slopes, obviously I'm not an expert in ski slopes, but obviously efficiency measures to around snow generation. We covered the ice rink obviously during the day to ensure that was drawing as little power as possible to keep the ice frozen. So there's various different measures you can put in place, but as I say, there is a limit because of what you're trying to do.
That makes sense. And kind of in the big picture, Mark and I talk a lot about how whether it's theme parks, zoos, museums, all of them really need those special seasonal events. I think in the last 20 years, we've seen starting with Halloween, there's been that evolution from, oh, that's an interesting way to make a little bit of money to now it being really kind of a key metric in everybody's budget. How do you really see these kind of winter events, whether it's holiday based or just winter themed, aligning with the goals of theme parks and other facilities to grow during the wintertime?
I mean, I think it's staying relevant, right? I mean, I think most museums now of a particular scale understand that they need to keep their content relevant. Whether you're a museum or a theme park or any type of attraction, you've really got to play into the season. You've obviously really got to understand your audience and understand your market segments and what they're looking for. I mean, I've recently been in South Africa, and obviously there's an enormous amount of tourism in South Africa, particularly over the European winter months. And of course, the South Africans know that, and they understand that demographic well. They understand what people are seeking. They understand that people are coming from Europe to Cape Town, so they will offer them winterized experiences in a way that they might see in Europe. The only difference is, of course, that the weather is a hell of a lot better than they would be experiencing in Europe at that time. So it's just about maintaining relevance. And of course, if as you say, the market is shifting to that more and more. But similarly, you see museums now, cultural institutions that have historically, in the UK at least, and in the US even, been regarded as quite stuffy, going into hosting festivals and concerts. There's been a tradition now for a while of country houses in the UK hosting EDM festivals, for instance, on a very small scale, quite niche, quite high end. So I think it all plays into that same aspect of maintaining relevance for your customer base, attendee base.
And when I was looking at the projects you'd worked on, I was kind of shocked because there were so many different ones globally with also a lot of different styles. What do you think is one of the most memorable projects to you that you've worked on, either as a designer or just from the guest experience that it created?
Yeah, I'm a bit of a jack of all trades, master of none in the events world, it's fair to say. In terms of memorable projects, I mean, certainly Taste of London in Regent's Park comes to mind because it's incredibly complex, and you've got 52 restaurants in the middle of Regent's Park actually cooking with full brigades in the backs of tents. So to see that operation and to get into that operation over the course of, 3 or 4 years after IMG purchased the event whilst I was there. It was incredibly interesting. Recently, I always say you're only as good as your last project, right? So I think, recently I've done some stuff with Live Nation in Egypt, where they've started to test the market and start to host major live concerts in the region. And those have been incredibly challenging. I'm a bit of an event geek, so I like a problem to solve. I don't like it to be easy. A bit of an event masochist. And so working through some of those problems and some of those cultural nuances and making things work to an international standard in markets that traditionally aren't used to hosting concerts on the scale or at the standard or with the production values of something you would see in the US or the UK. I mean, those have been the memorable things for me recently, I think.
And I think you touch on something interesting there. You're bringing something really unique to a lot of different cultures that maybe don't have experience with it. As you step back and listeners are thinking about maybe bringing something like this to their facility, what are 1 or 2 lessons that you've learned kind of the hard way, maybe sometimes, about this whole process that you would say really have changed the way you think about creating these events?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing that I've learned, I left IMG in the UK in 2017 and went to the US. And Adam, you'll know that the US is a very, very different market culturally from the UK. Two countries, the 2 countries divided by a common language quote is incredibly true.
Yeah.
And so, living in different places and different markets, and now in Africa, I think you learn to do your research a lot more, and you learn to really get into the mindset of your attendee base. And really understand the cultural nuances, because I think you can get lazy, particularly in the events world. I'm sure in the attractions world too, where you inherently understand the attendees, you understand the customer, and so you sort of have this intrinsic way of going about things. Whereas I don't always understand that now going into a market, and so you end up doing a lot of research, and you do uncover really interesting things that perhaps people that do operate on gut feel, because they are within that culture themselves, don't understand or haven't realized before. And that's really interesting. I think in an ideal world, we'd all do that kind of discovery piece really, really well. And even in a market that you felt you understand, you'd really look at it, you really do your research. But unfortunately, you don't always have time, you don't always have the opportunity. So that's the thing that's changed for me. It's the kind of research and it's the upfront planning, which is not necessarily logistical or technical now. It's more about what is the culture, what is acceptable, what does the audience expect, etc.
And that's a great point, because I think so many times people in our industry, we pull something together and you learn lessons from it. Then you kind of get on cruise control after you're successful. And I think it takes a lot of willpower sometimes to step back and say, okay, we're trying something new, or we're bringing in a new event, doing things differently. They try to play every metric that they had on previous projects to this new one, when for things like you're doing, definitely I feel like you say, if they have the time, which a lot of times bosses don't give people, unfortunately, to step back, but having that sort of time to be creative and understand the process, I think just helps the end product so much in the end.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, there's different business in the events world. Obviously, there's the big promoters where a lot of the KPIs are financially driven, right? If you're a Live Nation or you're IMG, you want ROI, and you need ROI in that type of business, right? You need to keep the lights, not just the lights on, but this enormous cadre of incredible people working and doing great projects. But if you're a brand, then obviously your metrics are entirely different. I think I've been fortunate enough to work with some great brands as well, who will give you the time to sit back and think and be creative. It doesn't always happen, of course, but as a producer, you have to roll with it and take the opportunities where you can, I think, to be creative. And fortunate enough to work with some of those clients in the past myself.
And I guess looking forward, as we think about this, we've talked about it sort of evolution from being sort of in the wings to now being a key part of people's business plans. What do you see for the whole winter event space over the next decade as it continues to grow? And in my opinion, I think in a very short time in mature markets like the US, it's going to be as important as Halloween, almost already is. Where do you see it going over time?
Yeah, I agree with you, Adam. I think US is the real growth area for winterized events. I mean, the pinnacle for me, which again is an IMG event that I was lucky enough to work on whilst I was there, is Winter Wonderland in Hyde Park in London. I mean, it's an enormous event. I mean, when I was there, the visitor count was something like 7 million, and I'm sure it's
Mhm.
more now. But that type of event hasn't really gained a foothold properly in the US yet. And I think when you look at the tier one markets like New York, Chicago, LA, certainly areas of Florida, particularly Miami, and you're doing stuff in the Middle East where it's obviously a very different climate. These are hot climates, right? Some of
Yeah.
the hottest climates you can imagine. So the climate and the weather isn't necessarily a barrier to presenting a great experience for somebody around a winter or a Christmas theme. But I think again the US is the real growth area there, and I think we're starting to see more interest from some of the major producers in the tier one markets in the US. So growth in the kind of horizontal sense to expand these concepts geographically, but also I think with technology, and everyone's talking about AI at the moment. I don't think there's been enough discussion about how AI might affect the events industry and how we might leverage it for better content, better visitor experience. And so I'm kind of excited to take part in a few more of those discussions and see how that technology can to really help supercharge some of those experiences. It doesn't just apply to winterized experiences. Obviously, this is across the board. So I think some of that might feature quite heavily in terms of growth and change of the industry in the next 10 years for sure.
With that as well, we obviously talk about theme parks a lot, and we have a lot of people from the theme park attraction industry on the podcast. Do you think there's a kind of middle ground or more of a crossover that might potentially happen in the future between theme parks as a whole, these kind of destinations to visit that might be on multiple months or years, with winterized events, or something that could become a bit more year round? Do you think there is scope of that, and maybe movements or rumblings at the moment that could be something that will happen in the future?
I think so. I mean, when you look at the business models around things like Winter Wonderland, you do start to think, how far can we go with this? And I know that's a kind of question that an IMG will ask. How long can we run this? For how long can we keep this relevant? Because ultimately, the longer you run the event, the more revenue you generate. If you're working on financial KPIs, that's good. But obviously they're not going to do that unless they think the audience is there and they're still going to be able to provide a great experience. I think the issue from an events perspective, and we operate very differently, as you know, from the attractions industry. You're working in sometimes very challenging sites where a theme park operator will go in and spend very many years obviously developing a site. They'll look very strategically at location. The events industry is a little bit more opportunistic, and we're obviously going for the marquee sites like in London, Regent's Park, Central Park in New York, for instance. From an event organizer perspective, you're looking to minimize risk because you're operating on much shorter turnaround times. From concept to execution is a much shorter window than an attractions or a theme park producer, sorry. So I think anything you can do, obviously, to minimize risk through location, through marketing partnerships, through the kind of content that you put on and the way you structure that content or the way you structure the deals for that content, that's where the focus is. I don't know if an IMG is going to become a theme park producer overnight because I think they're very different business models. But I do think the theme park industry, it sounds more like the theme park industry will move into winterized events. But as you guys know better than me, it's all about the strength of your IP. Do you have an IP strong enough that's going to sustain that kind of content year round, or for a very, very large part of the year? I mean, I know when we were doing Winter Wonderland and producing the ice rink and the ice slide for Lusail Winter Wonderland in Qatar, which was on behalf of IMG, who ran that event. That park was open for about 3.5 months, I think. So they really stretched that. It was, I think, and you get an opportunity, I think, in those kind of non-traditional Christmas markets to do that because, again, people aren't necessarily associating winter events or Christmas with a particular time of year. So, yeah, there's a lot there, but I think it's more likely the theme park world moves that way instead of the events industry moving into the theme park space by running events year round.
Oh, definitely. I think it's a couple of theme parks and events that I was involved with which were specifically winter ones as well, every year it kind of crept up by 2 or 3 weeks at a time, and it was going bigger and bigger and bigger. And it was amazing to see the growth and longevity behind them events. So yeah, I'm really excited to see kind of where it goes with them two worlds merging.
Yeah. Yeah, and look, in the events world, we operate on fear of loss, right? It's a perishable product, so you want to keep things relevant. You want to keep it new and fresh, and so there was a period in the UK where outdoor ice rinks, are popping up all over the place, and now it seems to have rolled back a bit. I remember seeing one in Liverpool several years ago, and now that seems to have moved on. But you've got to be able to keep those relevant, and even within, I mean, the Natural History Museum ice rink in London isn't there anymore, but the IMG run another ice rink now at Battersea Power Station, and I know the team there spend an enormous amount of effort doing mini events within that format, within the ice rink. So it's not just about putting it there and sitting back. There's an enormous operation there to just keep the event relevant, which is quite tiring. I think everyone's pretty exhausted by the end of that run, which is probably somewhere around 2.5, 3 months. So sustaining that over a full year as a theme park does. Again, our industry works very differently, so maybe there's a good model for doing that the events world hasn't found yet.
Oh, fantastic. So Daniel, thank you so much for the insight into ice events and all winterized events. It's been great to hear, and I think all of our listeners will agree with that as well. It's such a different insight to what we normally listen to, so it's great. Thank you so much for your time. We're going to move on now to our fast pass round. So we tweak these questions compared to our normal ones a little bit, just to kind of fit what industry you're in. So the first question we've got is, if you've got to pick any event, any experience that you've created, that you've worked on, what is your favorite one that you've worked on to date?
Oh, difficult question. I would say the Trace Awards in Kigali in Rwanda, because it was about the biggest event Rwanda had ever staged at that point. We flew in 52 Afrobeats artists, did a major televised music awards, which was kind of unthinkable at the time, and we pulled off the impossible. So that was a pretty memorable one.
You've been lucky enough to see, I think, a lot of different things globally. What is one of your favorite events that you've seen that you felt offered something different or unique when you visited?
I have to go back quite a way for this. It would have been the International Festival of Live Art, which used to be held in Glasgow. I come from a theatre performance background, and there's a venue, still a venue in Glasgow called Tramshed, and they used to host this festival of performance artists and live art from around the world. And the way it was curated, the way it was put together, the kind of experiences that you have there, for me, really push the boundaries of what live experience could be, because that is the nature of performance art. So, and that was back, I'm talking probably 15 years ago or more. So those events really, really stick in my mind. Fortunately, performance art isn't necessarily particularly financially viable as an art form, so you tend not to see a lot of it. But that for me, the International Festival of Live Art in Glasgow was a standout event. But mainly because of my passion and background in performance and theatre.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds great. I think Scotland as well is great for live performance and performance art. It's
Incredible.
Just, especially with like the Fringe Festival in Edinburgh, it's just such a live place for theatre, I think. And I think it's often it's overlooked a lot of the time. People don't realise that, but it's a melting pot of so much culture and theatre. I love it.
I should have said, actually, something that's in that vein. I should have said Marina Abramovich at MoMA in New York, where she was sat at a table in the gallery space, and you could come and sit opposite her. And it's a completely silent piece. You're just staring at Marina Abramovich. He was one of my heroes. And so to do that and to take part in that, utterly incredible. I mean, that is, again, it's about pushing the boundaries of what an event and what live experience can be. But I like that stuff. It gives you ideas, and it gives you inspiration for the kind of day-to-day stuff that you create.
Love
Fantastic. And the last question that we have for you is, what do you think a key trend is going to be in the experiential world or the event world? What do you think is going to change over the next couple of years?
I think we're going to see delivery teams get smaller because of the way you can start to now use technology to do a lot of the administrative planning. So I think the actual delivery teams will get smaller. I think the creativity will get stronger, again, because you can use technology in a way that kind of challenges your assumptions, challenges your creative ideas, helps you bump things up and punch ideas up. I think in terms of the delivery, I think technology is going to have a massive impact on personalization of experiences, whether that's being recommended experiences or going to a museum and getting a personalized tour created just for you. I'm really excited about some of the augmented reality developments, particularly in relation to museum experiences and how the technology is going to develop there. As soon as battery packs and processing power gets smaller and more efficient, I think we're going to see a lot more of that. I've already seen an exhibition in China where you can go and talk to a painting and the responses are powered by AI and you're speaking to Van Gogh, or, so I think technology is going to have a massive impact on the way experiences are delivered in that world.
Oh, that's awesome. I'm in complete agreement too. And I just think VR was the thing for so many years, but I think as we move forward, just the potential for AR, that kind of dance between the virtual and real worlds, is going to be a great mesh as the technology just gets better and better.
Definitely. We're just waiting for it. We're just trying to get to that point where it's portable enough and it's got enough battery power and processing power. There's enough content, and I think it will be awesome, particularly for museum experiences. I'm sure you've covered a lot of that on the podcast as well.
No, definitely.
It's amazing to see how quick that technology is actually upgrading. We're talking day on day now. It's getting that quick, and there's so many different providers. It's a really exciting place to be in to see how that's going to influence everything that we do, whether that's events or experiences or theme parks. It's going to influence all of it, and it's so exciting to see.
Definitely, really, really exciting time.
Well, Daniel, thank you so much for joining us today. Let everybody know on whether it's a website or social media, where can people find you and your company?
Yeah, connect with me on LinkedIn, linkedin.com/in/Daniel Noake. Website is my company, Hammerton Barca. We're at www.hammertonbarca.com. And keep up with me on social media. All the socials are @Dan Noake.
Fantastic. Mark, what are your socials?
Mine are Mark Loft CD. So you can find me on LinkedIn, you can find me on X, and you can find me everywhere. Email's probably the best part, but yeah, LinkedIn. Get me on LinkedIn. I'm always on LinkedIn.
There we go. And I'm Adam, and you can find me at Roller Coaster Sales Guy on Instagram and on LinkedIn also. And as always, a huge thank you to our partners at blooloop for being our partners and hosts for this project. We appreciate it. blooloop.com for all the industry's news. Daniel, thank you so much, and we will see everybody next month.
Pleasure talking to you guys. Thank you.